Since the time of Aristotle, metaphysics has been an ill-defined term. This paper defines it as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality, which couples the two initial ingredients of awareness, perceptual reality, the basis of physics, and cognitive perceptual syntax, a formalization of mind. One very important application of logical induction relates to the two initial ingredients of reality just mentioned: the external world of objective perceptual content and the internal world of cognition and the syntactic and semantic structures to which it conforms. These two ingredients, which are given and need not be assumed, are related by a mapping that can be simply expressed as M is a mapping that couples L and U, where L is a language of cognition and perception, along with the formal, ideal, or abstract ingredients of that language, includes cognitive perceptual accepting syntax in its entirety. U is the universe of the language, for example, the perceptual universe. And M is the metalanguage expressing the mapping of L to U and U to L via the two-headed arrow, which can represent cognition, perception, attribution, recognition, information, or anything else that bridges the dualistic gulf between form and content.
So logical induction generically educes global syntax from the two initial ingredients of reality, perceptual reality, and accepting syntax. And so here we say that an application of logical induction is to identify this mapping that relates these two ingredients. Accepting syntax is generalized to this language L of cognition, perception, along with all the formal ingredients that it has, formal, ideal, or abstract ingredients of that language, including the cognitive perceptual accepting syntax in its entirety, meaning including both the categories of thoughts and perception of Kant, including the qualia, the syntax of qualia, the qualio-perceptual syntax, QPS. So logical induction relates this L, this cognitive aspect of the initial ingredients of reality, and U, the perceptual universe, the universe that contains information that can be read through the language, the universe that is configured by the language, that is recognized as satisfying the syntax of that language. And so logical induction models this meta-language M, which expresses the mapping from language to universe and universe to language. And this mapping covers many different things, the many different ways in which these two aspects of reality are related, with a cognition of U to the language L, with a perception of U through the language L, and we have perception of L in as much as there are instances of L in U, right? We attribute predicates, syntax from L to instances in U. We recognize L from U, right? So there's all this different mapping. I mean, information is really the coupling of L and U, as far as I understand it. And information is a structured state, a state structured in a specific way. And anything else that bridges this dualistic gulf between form and content would be represented by this mapping M. This mapping M creates the connection between the two initial ingredients of reality, between the cognitive aspect and the perceptual aspect, the universe that satisfies the instance of the language. And so when we start like this, we have already a connected identity because we formalize the relationship between L and U. So we don't have the dualistic gulf that separates the world of language on the one hand and the universe on the other hand. Logical induction at the explanatory limit educes this meta-language M, and so formalize this coupling between cognition and the universe, ultimately between mind and the universe, the language of cognition and perception with the universe of the language. So there is a universe that satisfies the formal properties of cognition and perception because of the coupling. And the coupling is controlled, so there's no gulf between form and content. There's a reunion of form and content within the mapping M. And that would stem from logical induction, which is at the explanatory limit, where explanation is global self-identification by the inductively idempotent identity operator. So there's a global self-identification at the explanatory limit through this deduction of global syntax with this generic educing of the global syntax And so out of this fixed point of self-explanation or self-cognition, there arises this M, which bridges the dualistic gulf between form and content, where reality seems separate between the universe and then the syntactic content that categorizes the universe, that puts specific instances, specific predicates satisfied by the universe. Actually, M come and saves the day and formalize through the meta language the mapping from L to U. And this formalization is a formalization that puts perception, attribution, recognition, cognition at the core of the resolution of the dualistic gulf. Information as a coupling of language and universe becomes this component of the meta-language mapping M. And so secondary tailors, secondary syntactic operators would be able to logically induce not only the global syntax and their own quantization mapping that includes them within the global syntax, but also this bridge between the language of cognition and universe, this M. And I think the universe is the perceptual universe in the broadest understanding of this meta-language M, of this mapping M, but this mapping is also valid for sub-coupling within the global coupling. And so that's why we would say, in general, L is the language of cognition, is a language of cognition, right? And U is the universe of that language. So you allow M to be a more generic coupling, which is not like the overall coupling where U becomes the perceptual universe and L becomes cognitive, perceptual, accepting syntax in its entirety and all the ingredients of that language. M can be a more generic mapping that doesn't refer to the full universe, but in the broadest understanding, U becomes this perceptual universe. And M is the bridge between the formal component of reality, L, and the universe U.
The mapping M may look unimpressive, but it is deceptively powerful. It is a minimal model of cognition and perception, and attribution and information as well, and is capable of exhibiting all the essential toe properties mentioned above. It is also just another way of looking at a Syndiffeonic relation, and is therefore a model of relational structure. U is just a set of discernible entities or diffeonic relands, while L incorporates the synetic intention of any given subset of U, with M taking responsibility for the distribution of L over U. And last but not least, it is also a way of characterizing the global identity of reality, a compact model of thought and experience, which forms the nucleus of advanced reality theory.
So in order to relate the language L to the universe U, we have this meta-language that couples L and U, that bridge the gap between L and U via cognition, perception, attribution, recognition, and so on. And the question is it trivial what we just did? What is defining this meta-language M? Is it just a notation without any implication that cannot receive really any property? It's just this theoretical link between L and U. And here we say the mapping M itself is powerful because it models cognition and perception. It defines cognition and perception as this thing that relates the language L to the universe U. Same as perception, same as attribution, same as information. And it models cognition and perception in a way that is able to exhibit all of the essential toe properties, which were intelligibility, distributivity. The toe is recognized through elements, so it distributes towards the elements. Self-explanation. M can be self-explanatory, can display inductive idempotence. M can be dually self-distributed over its component, formally and topologically. M can be logically consistent, can distribute logic within itself. And M can be this language that stems from logical induction, so that stems from something certain that distributes logic within itself. So all of the essential toe properties that we have outlined can now be assigned to this M, to this mapping that couples the language and the universe. And in doing so, we model cognition and perception as a fundamental bridge between the formal, the linguistic, the cognitive perceptual syntax, and the universe. So M is this fundamental concept that we use to bridge the dualistic gulf between form and content, and that is able to receive the essential toe properties that we need to model self-intelligibility, self-explanation, logical consistency. within the theory of reality. M is another way to look at a Syndiffeonic relation. So M is a model of relational structure, which means that M also models sameness and difference, generality and specificity, invariance and variation, set theoretic aggregation and discernment, all of the relational structure that we have outlined with the Syndiffeonic relation. We said that Syndiffeonic relation relates cognition and perception, so the cognitive perceptual syntax and the object of perception, the percepts. And we have this again where here M is more directly a model of cognition and perception, and it's just another way of looking at the Syndiffeonic relation. I would say the Syndiffeonic relation is more directly focused on the synetic and diffeonic level. We were writing S of D1, D2, D3, and so we really show D1, D2, D3 as following this S, as being aggregated under this S, or as being generated under the structure of S, depending on if the Syndiffeonic relation is seen as passive or active. And we had the self-dual aspect of the synetic level and the diffeonic level. And here with M, to me, it's a step further because now M is really the mapping that couples L and U, and L and U are really like the synetic level and the diffeonic level. U is a set of discernible entities or diffeonic relans, and L incorporates the synetic intention of any given subset of U. So M seems to be a more intentional way to look at the coupling of L and U, a latent object of Syndiffeonesis. In Syndiffeonesis, you have the synetic level and the diffeonic level, which is our L and U, and we've given all of these properties of this Syndiffeonesis. It is active and passive, it models cognition and perception, it is a general qualification of sameness and difference that underlies any particular relation identified within reality, so it's a universal relational structure. And here we outline the fact that this link between the synetic and the diffeonic rely on this M, on this mapping, which takes the responsibility of distributing L over U, the synetic over the diffeonic. And so it seems to me to be a powerful modeling of a Syndiffeonic relation where we can assign properties to this coupling to Syndiffeonesis itself. Instead of being stuck in the object level with the synetic and the diffeonic, we attribute properties which belong to the Syndiffeonic level, which belong to the coupling of the two under the mapping M. It seems to be a more intentional modeling of the Syndiffeonic relation. And Syndiffeonic relation was really the fundamental aspect of syntax and universe that we want to outline for the logical induction of the properties of the universe. We don't want to fix a rigid set of syntax. We want to look at the general link between syntax and universe, right? And so we have to have a powerful way of describing this link. And so this M is really this bridge between the synetic and the diffeonic, the language and the universe. And it is ultimately this way of characterizing the global identity of reality. So we're talking about the identity of reality as that which metaphysics is supposed to reveal, supposed to ground, supposed to outline, to identify, to give to knowledge a solid ground, a solid framework. And so this global identity of reality, we can think of it as this M that performs this coupling between L and U. So a compact model of thought and experience, which form the nucleus of advanced reality theory. The experience comes from the coupling of a universe with a language. And so it really comes down to this M, this mapping that bridges language and universe through cognition to perception. So yes, there is cognition and perception. There is this anthropic coupling between the self-modeling entity and the universe, between the language of the universe and the universe itself. So there are these conscious entity, this information entity, this attributive entity within the universe. And this understanding will stem from the understanding of the global identity of reality, this M. And to account for what reality is, we'll have to account for this coupling of language and universe. And so we'll have to talk about cognition, perception. And so cognition and perception become essential in this theory. It doesn't appear as an emergent thing, which is unexplained, but it stands for the essential mathematical metaphysics of the universe, which has this mapping M that distributes L over U. And so M has these linguistic properties. It has this structure and dynamics of the language with the linear evolution and the orthogonal evolution, these meta-simultaneous causal patterns that drive the evolution of the universe. And it carries this properties, this anti-closure existential self-sufficiency, which comes down to self-identification. M will perform this global self-identification by the inductively idempotent identity operator. So it will perform this logical induction and distribute logic internally. And so within this mapping M from L to U and U to L, you have the preservation of the logical consistence of the universe, the resolution of the paradoxes, because of this true and false mapping distributed over its components. And so this meta-language bridges explicitly the synetic and this diffeonic entities of you with the self-cognition, self-perception, self-attribution, self-information in a global way, and also just as a model of relational structure in general. So when you have a relation, you can think of it as a sub-M, not the M of the global identity of reality, but just one of the M's that ties a language to the universe. So if you think of a set, you can think of it as a Syndiffeonic relationship or as a meta-linguistic mapping M that ties the intension of the set to the extension of the set. And in the more global sense, it will become the nucleus of advanced reality theory. So the object that receives all the properties that we identify for the toe, for the theory of everything about reality.
A few observations regarding the above mapping are in order. First, the whole thing can be contracted to M alone. For as we have already mentioned, a meta-language like M must include its object language L, and L must syntactically embed its content. So, equation 3, M equals M, which includes L, which includes U. In other words, reality can be entirely packaged in the toe meta-language M. However, this requires a bit more explanation. For example, 1, the intentional language L is operator quantized. 2, M is metasubjectively mapped onto the L quanta with a special hological kind of one-to-many mapping, and is coherent and therefore singular, whereas L quantization produces many L operators. 3, the two inclusion signs carry different senses of inclusion. 4, L metarizes U, inducing on it a dual geometry.
So the first observation regarding the mapping M that couples L and U is that it actually can be contracted to M. So the nucleus of advanced reality theory, which was M is a mapping that couples L and U, this model of Syndiffeonesis can actually be understood as M with a refined understanding of M as this singular meta-language that contains its object language L, which embeds syntactically the content U of the universe. And so all these objects converge into this M, this meta-language that reflects the identity of reality, this theory of reality. And this inclusion is achieved by combining different sense of inclusion, which really reflect the different relationships between the different objects that we've put forward. So the meta-language M contains the object language L, and it contains it in the sense that L is operator quantized, meaning there are different operators, syntactic operators that form the language L. So the syntax, the rule, the grammar is sort of dispersed into these different operators. And so M, the meta-language M, is then surjectively mapped onto the L quanta. It's a singular entity, M, and yet there's a one-to-many mapping that makes it so that it's surjective. Surjective means that the function points to all of the elements of the domain of the function, right? So here you have a mapping that goes from M to L. L has many operators, and there is a surjection of M to each linguistic element in L, which is operator quantized. So all these linguistic ingredients of the object language L are within operators. And so there's a one-to-many mapping, which in that case is hological. So the global operator M hologically transports substructures of M within operators of L. And so you have this tree from one root M. You have different branches which reflect the different operators in L. And this L reflects the intentional language L. So all the intention of intention, extension, couplings. So a tree about the syntax that categorizes, that give functions to element, to content. And so as a result, the fact that L is included in M really reflects this hological mapping. And so this inclusion sense has a specific meaning when you go from M to L. And when you look at the inclusion of U in L, you also have a syntactic embedment. Any content of the universe is passed through syntactic ingredient in L, which is like the cognitive perceptual syntax of the language. So you have content that satisfies this cognitive perceptual syntax. And it also metrizes U. L metrizes U. It induces a metric on you. So there's a geometry there. So the geometry of the universe, the lattice of the universe with world lines, with objects that have spatial temporal distance between them, that only update, their physical state according to invariants such as the speed of light, the speed of expansion in the CTMU. All of this geometry is induced on the content. So L, although it's a language that contains, the categories of thoughts, the qualias, the QPS, it also induces the geometry, the dual geometry, which makes it so that all of this Platonic syntax, all of this Kantian syntax of logic is dualized geometrically in a space where, the distribution of energy of objects within a geometrical manifold becomes dual to this Platonic realm of ideas, to this Platonic realm of syntax. So there's dual geometry that is induced on the content. So that's how you go from the singular M that carries within it the framework of recognition, attribution, perception, information. So that couples L and U, the Syndiffeonic and the Diffeonic, the category and the instances that satisfy this category, right? You go from this M to this hological distribution of M within operators in L. So then the syntax of the language is dispersed in all of these branches, right? From the same root, which is M. And finally, these branches, they actually induce a geometry. So then, there are some leaves, and the leaves of L, which is the U, they actually live within an intrinsic geometry, and they satisfy the cognitive perceptual syntax that is distributed on the content by L. So the operators in L will perceive U, will recognize U, so they will have this network of cognitive perceptual syntax on U, and U will have this metric, this geometry induced on it by L. And so you really arrive at this expansion of the metalanguage into concrete, particles in space and time with specific energy that reflect this singular metalanguage M. So that's sort of the tree that you have here with the trunk, and then branches that in that case are not even, they don't reflect a geometry, so you cannot really picture the branches. It's a mereology in the pure theory of language where the operators are just mapped hologically. So you cannot really picture it in space, so you don't actually have branches. But when you talk about the leaves, which are the actual content produced by those branches, then you have a geometry that is induced. And it all reflects M, this metalanguage. And so there's this inclusion because everything stems from M, M generatively distributes onto L quanta, and then U is descriptively contained in L. And in the CTMU, there's an idea that the universe topologically contains that which descriptively contains the universe. And so that would mean that the universe topologically contains L quanta, and the L quanta descriptively contain the universe. In this, I feel I'm understanding it a bit of a different way, because I would have thought that the topological inclusion is really sort of the mapping of U to L, meaning that L is really topologically contained in U. But here we focus more on the different sense of inclusion, which are still within the realm of the descriptive mapping. M distributes meta-surjectively onto L, and then, L contains descriptively U, because U is just a set of instances that satisfy the predicates or the laws or the syntax defined in L. It satisfies it, and it also satisfies the geometry induced on U. And so M being the source of information, of consciousness, of perception, of recognition, of the mapping, really unfolds into sub-quanta of information definers almost, which couple to a universe that are an instance of this information. A universe that is a percept perceived by the L quanta, according to the L syntax. So when we say E of L equals L, we are saying that this upper quantized L actually contains the explanation. So I think we established that it's a theoretical covering of L, but we have to understand that it is a covering onto an operator quantized language. So M is coherent, it exists on all scales, while the L operators can be distinct entities that are local, that don't directly communicate to each other, but that communicate to the source M. So the metalanguage, with this dual sense of containment, establishes the coupling of L to U, takes the responsibility of the coupling of L and U. And the topological inclusion of L within the universe, I think, reflects the dependence that L has over U, creating a true coupling, not a hierarchy of U being just the sort of the visible branches of the root, but it is a more complex image where the leaves, can redefine branches. So you take the same leaves, now the branches adjust to the leaves. You'll define a universe, and then there's an opportunity to redefine syntax, a quanta, that will perceive the universe in a certain way. They will organize the universe in a certain way. So now the branches readjust onto these leaves. And what stays the same is the root, right? The mapping M stays the same, but the branches will adjust to this U. What will not adjust to this U is, the global theoretical language that stays invariant and that really preserves the coherence of M, preserves, the overall structure of the overall mapping of how L quanta relate to U. So there's something invariant about the branches, but the branches will readjust based on U. So there's also a depending on from U to L, even though it's contained in it. And it comes from the fact that there's different sense of inclusions and different functional dependency. So it's not like the inclusion in a set where the set redefines what's included within it, let's say, but there is a sense in which some of the components of these strings of inclusions are depending one on the other. And so here, the sense is the hological one-to-many mapping, and then the syntactic embedment, the metric embedment, like L metriizes U, which has to follow this geometry that is induced on it by L, right?
Secondly, there is an aspect of Syndiffeonesis that we have not yet discussed. A Syndiffionic relation amounts to something called a metatautology or self-dual tautology, whereas a propositional tautology generally amounts to an element of logical syntax roughly equivalent to the self-identity of a sentential variable, for example, x equals x, where x is an arbitrary attribution. And a semantic tautology is a similar redundancy within a specific attribution. For example, a horse is a horse, or a rose is a flower. A metatautology is a self-dual input-acceptor redundancy, whereby an input datum doubles as an element of the accepting syntax of the acceptor or generic observer or thinker. The shift of data type of an identity between percept and percipient, the thing observed and the accepting /generative syntax of the observer, is a dualization operation, i.e., the symmetric rotation of a self-dual identity between logical data types, in this case, perceptual input and cognitive perceptual syntax.
So Syndiffeonesis is the most general structure of intelligibility within reality. It's the general structure of relation between sameness and difference, the predicate and the instances satisfying the predicates, a core ingredient of the intelligibility of reality. It puts all of the differences within a synesis that connects the differences and that allows the mind of the scientific relationship to organize those differences within specific structures that put them together. All of the set theoretic description of reality, so all of the model theory that is based on sets satisfying certain structures, they are based on this set theoric Syndiffeonesis of the intention of the set and then the extension of the elements of the set. So Syndiffeonesis is really this core building block of intelligibility. And here we see that there is an aspect of Syndiffeonesis that we can call metatautology. So we're learning a new aspect of Syndiffeonesis. And it amounts to self-dual tautology. And when you look at tautologies, they amount to identities, logical syntax that are true by construction, x equals x is true, for example, where x can be any attribution. So x equals x is a tautology, so it's based on an identity. So self-identity of what is on the left or what is on the right of an attribution. So self-identity of a sentential variable in propositional logic. And semantic tautology is a different kind of tautology where semantic attribution is true by definition because it is sort of an analytic truth within the concept. A rose is a flower by construction, and so a rose is a flower is a tautology. It doesn't bring anything experiential or new. It doesn't do any synthetic judgment between different categories. We're just describing sort of how the concepts are built. A rose is a subcategory of flower by definition, and so saying that a rose is a flower is a semantic tautology. It's something that is true by redundancy of this statement with how the semantic is defined. We're just outlining the semantic structure itself. A horse is a horse. We're just saying something that is true with how we define the semantic ingredient, and so they remain true when we spell them out. And these two introduction of tautology, of how you can look at tautologies, show a different kind of redundancy, which in that case is a redundancy across data types. So x equals x is within the same data type. It's like logical syntax, syntactic tautology. In a semantic tautology, we have a tautology, again, within the domain of semantic. And here we have a metatautology because it's not within the same domain. It's a self-duality between input and acceptor. So instead of stating the equality of object within the same domain, here you're rotating the domain between the percept and the percipient, the thing observed and the accepting/generative syntax of the observer. And that is to say that there is a self-dual relationship between the intention and the extension, between the synetic aspect of Syndiffeonesis and the diffeonic aspect. And the concept becomes dualized with these instances of the concept. And this is sort of a new kind of tautology, which brings the self-duality and which brings it between the perceptual input and the cognitive perceptual syntax. And so when we were saying that the observer identifies itself metatautologically in contradistinction to its environment, we were saying that the observer has a syntax and a perception of that syntax, or the percept and the percipient, and these are put in a metatautology structure, which is the structure of Syndiffeonesis. And so it means that there is not, on the one hand, the universe, and then the syntax emerging as a description of the universe, or the syntax that falls down to the universe, but the two ingredients are coupled within a self-duality. And so observation, apprehension, attribution, information, all of those stem from metatautology, which means there's no dead end in how does the percept and the perception connect, because they both connect from the self-dual metatautology. And so they rotate between the logical data types, and you sort of have this equality between the two, which is a shift in domain, and so meta-equality, self-dual tautology. And so when you ask, why is there the syntax of this object? Well, the object is self-dual to the syntax. There's equality, so there's tautological structure, self-dual tautological structure that allows to make the object emerge at the same time as the syntax. That allows to connect the cognitive perceptual syntax and the perceptual input. And so when you look at a Syndiffeonic relation within a set, the intention and the extension of the set emerge from the same self-dual tautology, which is a tautology that emerged at the ontologic or epistemologic domain of reality, and that explains how specific relationships emerge and how they can connect the percept and the percipient. They connect it meta-tautologically.
Having defined a metatautology, we can now expand the concept by making use of our two initial ontological ingredients, the two things that we are absolutely given without assumption upon birth into this reality. The Esse percipi and cogito ergo sum of reality theory, perceptual reality, or the objective environment consisting of external states, and cognitive perceptual syntax, or mind, consisting of the subjective inner world of mental internal states and state transitions.
So the metatautology couples the synetic and the diffeonic, and this expands to the initial ingredients that we have in reality, perceptuality, that we link to the Esse, est, percipi. To be is to be perceived. It's the objective environment consisting of external states. So it's the objective reality of all the instances of reality that we all share. And then the cognitive perceptual syntax or mind, which is the cogito ergo sum of René Descartes, which is the acknowledgement of the existence of the mind that consists the subjective inner world of mental internal states and state transitions. So the internal mind, the internal time of the mind, whereas the esse est percipi is the recognition of the objective reality, perceptual reality. And so the mind is not floating on its own without the perceptual environment. It's going to be coupled with the environment. And so where metatautology concerns specific relations, specific Syndiffeonic relation, here we're going to couple the two basic ingredients of reality to make the structure of how they are related emerge and to properly define the identity of reality. And so the esse est percipi comes from George Berkeley. And what is interesting is the objective reality, we ground it with this esse est percipi, which means we ground it with perception. Only the coupling of cognitive perceptual syntax and the objective environment compose a reality. We already condition the objective environment by the perception of this objective environment, which gives a ground to its being, its ontology. It's just worth to call out that this is the path of defining this mathematical metaphysics, is coupling this cognitive perceptual syntax and perceptual reality. We don't define an objective environment that would be isolated from perception, because then it would be isolated from reality. So it's a theory of reality that comes from our own condition, where everything that is perceived. And we know there's an objective environment. It remains perceived nonetheless. It remains tied to our own condition of assessing the existence of this objective environment, which is we perceive this environment. And when we build this overall identity of reality, we don't need to make a cut between our subjective world and the environment. We're going to couple the objective environment to our subjective condition. So that's where the self-dual tautology comes into play. We will rotate the data types, and so we will build the identity of reality upon a tautology, which happens to be this metatautology. So we don't leave the mystery of the cut of the gulf of Cartesian dualism, where the perception is cut to the environment, which would be in this very different world with matter in the continuum of space-time, or the manifold of the being of the objective world that is different from the subjective. We ground to where we start, the esse est percipi, and George Berkeley extends the esse est percipi to contain all of objective reality, because even the thing that is not perceived by someone exists for a mind, the mind of the identity of reality overall. So this is the direction where we're going, and we're able to keep the discussion within the concept of metatautologies of objects that are well coupled and well modeled mathematically. That couple, in that case, perceptual reality and cognitive perceptual syntax.
First, note that in addition to the two initial ingredients, L and U, we are also given the coupling between them. This is M, and we are implicated in M as entities in which the LU coupling occurs. As an identity, M can be considered one coherent entity which self-differentiates by Syndiffeonic self-stratification through the cumulative factorization of telesis, a dual generalization of energy properly defined to serve as the ultimate stuff of reality. Thus, rather than going through a sequence of steps to construct M, we are simply explaining how the aspects of M, as a mapping coupling L and U, interrelate, breaking up the explanation into parts and steps for the sake of clarity. The steps do not occur as a temporal sequence, but meta-simultaneously. The ingredients M, L, and U are interdependent and mutually recursively defined with respect to function. Although M can be considered to stand alone as a self-potentializing, self-actualizing global identity, creating L and U in the course of self-identification.
So in addition of L and U, in addition to the esse est percipi and cogito ergo sum, with the cogito ergo sum being L and esse est percipi being U, we have the mapping M, which couples the two together, which involves cognition, perception, attribution, information, recognition. So the mapping M is involved. So there aren't only these two ingredients, and we are implicated in them, in coupling the two. These two are two initial ingredients for us. We are implicating in the mapping of the two together. So we are implicated in the attribution, perception, cognition, and so on. We need to specify how they all tie together. And the idea is not that they would tie together in a temporal sequence. First, there's M, and then there's the language, and then there's U. This is more a functional dependency, while all of these different terms are interdependent and mutually recursively defined. So we cannot understand M in a temporal sequence. We have to understand M as this coupling that ties L and U, and it's meta-simultaneous, meaning we cannot breaking down into causality where first there's M and then there's L and then there's U. We are simply exposing the structure. We are educing the structure of this mapping M and the structure of how the universe bridges the gulf between form and content, between language and universe. So it's really this idea of mutual dependency of all these terms together, this idea that all the terms are defined as a function of the others. And so M can be considered to stand alone functionally because it self-identifies, and so it potentializes in L and U, it actualizes in L and U. But the only way we're going to describe that is by defining the structure as it stands, how M self-differentiated itself into L and U. So, M is one coherent entity, and it maps hologically to the different L operators. So we are implicated in M as entities, as an operator involved in the coupling of L and U. And M, this global identity, self-differentiates. It explores its own self-potentialization, self-actualization, and it self-stratifies. And here we talk about what its stratification is made of, and it's the cumulative factorization of telesis. Telesis, which factorizes into state and syntax, into language and universe, into form and content. And so telesis is a dual generalization of energy, where physics would define the ultimate stuff of reality as energy. Telesis here is shown as this dual generalization proper to the language of mathematical metaphysics. We need to talk about the ultimate stuff of reality, and so the ultimate stuff of reality will be telesis. And so it cumulatively factorizes telesis, meaning it evolves through the factorization of telesis, and it's self-evolve and self-stratifies through these acts of factorizing telesis, and so of establishing this coupling of L and U, which emerge as a specific case of telesis, which appears, and so which integrates in M coherently, just like you have energy being conserved according to the physical laws of the universe. Telesis factorizes within the identity M, which brings the overall structure of how syntax emerges within this overall self-differentiation of this global identity M. And so M cascades down to these factorization of telesis, so to this coupling of L and U, and to explain the identity of reality, so the global identity, we understand how the couplings of L and U are related to this M, which is the coupling of L and U, and which self-distributes. And so we can be implicated into M as a functional part of it, as a L operator, so hologically receiving the structure of M and being implicated into metrizing the universe U, into identifying the specific component that emerge, into factorizing telesis, into actualizing a potential that emerge as this cumulative integration of telesis within the global identity M. And so we need to define these different components as they integrate into each other. And so we go beyond the two initial ingredients of the cognitive perceptual syntax, of the cogito ergo sum, and of the Esse percipi, of what is perceived as the universe U, of the objective reality that emerges through our act of perception. We need to go beyond that and conceive of a mapping which has this structure of establishing the coupling of the two, of tying the two together and tying all of this coupling together within this one coherent entity M, the global identity, which just self-differentiates into every instance of Syndiffeonic identification that we can experience as a perception that satisfies syntactic rules, which we apply to the universe to extract information from these perceptions through this act of information, of cognition, of recognition. And so we are truly understanding M within these different branches as a meta-simultaneously functional distribution of its overall self-potentializing, self-actualizing capacity. And so we are clarifying what are the different parts of this self-identification. And so we are functionally defining this self-identification as a process built onto the ultimate stuff of reality, which in that case will be telesis. And so it will be properly defined as something that emerges basically as the stuff that achieves the coupling, a specified language universe coupling, a specified syntax and content coupling. And so it's a notion of energy as a creating force that is injected into the universe to change the state and syntax that evolves within the identity M, but is defined in a way that is directly linked to what are the functional stuff that M needs to distribute in order to evolve within the general function of M, which is the coupling of the language and the universe of L and U. And next, we'll go through each of these components and keep in mind that the breaking up of these components doesn't mean that they exist as a standalone entity. Rather, they exist as an emanation of M, as a self-identification of M through these functional aspects of M. The general linguistic syntax of M, the general universe that contains the geometry of M, that contains all of the specific instances responding to that syntax. These different components will show how M self-identifies and self-distributes through these elements. And we remain implicated in M as achieving this coupling of L and U, and as bridging the apparent gulf between mind and matter, between language and universe, between form and content. We have a stratification of function, of self-identification being the primary function that can self-potentialize and self-actualize into L and U. When we're talking about the self-potentialization and self-actualization, which is a result of self-identification, then we start to define M as functionally dependent from L and U, which are the aspect of M that we need to talk about to reflect how it self-identifies through its own language and universe. But in terms of function, just as telesis is the joint medium through which state and syntax can emerge metatautologically, where the syntax and the instance reflect one of the same thing, just the rotation of the object between different data types, M also is one ingredient that ties together L and U, so that is able, through the functional primacy of self-identification, to explain the different ingredients of the metaphysics of the language and the universe, which we observe as implicated in M self-identifying through this L and U coupling. And so when we achieve this L and U coupling, we are part of this original, singular and coherent unified entity M, which self-identifies through us. And so there is this unity that remains as an original foundational aspect of what ultimately implicates us in reality. And so the holistical production of M within the L operators explain how we can be connected to one entity. Not only telesis allows the connectivity of state and syntax of a particular thing as emerging from one coherent telesis that explain how syntax has state corresponding to it and state has syntax that allows it to become a specific state. But we also have this functional M, this functional operator M, this coherent identity, which allows sub-identities to experience reality, to achieve a sub-mapping of it where specific language and specific universe is tied together, specific Syndiffeonic relations emerge within local operators within M, the overall universe. And so M is really sort of a mirror of the global identity which we are part of. And so a mirror that explains how we can locally identify reality without being the global operator, because we're mirroring a global function achieved by reality through M, which is this global self-identification of reality, which we are simply implicated as local instances of this identification of reality. Just as we are dependent on our mind and our specific instantiation in the universe, we too can be considered a identity which may generalize beyond, the L and U coupling. And so although we are also recursively defined with respect to our LU coupling, there is a part of the coupling which is just this mapping of the two together, which may be defined beyond this specific language and universe, which our experience of reality consists, but which we may be a direction of mapping of telesis which generalize past our specific temporal experience. And so this also speaks to the metaphysical being and the metaphysical soul that specific tellers might maintain with the global identity M of reality, where the soul of the teller may reflect the application of syntax that is distributed beyond their own specific instantiation on this specific individual coupling of body and mind that appears through the space-time geometry, which is specific to the universe U, with L metrizing U and establishing telesis as a generalized dual of energy, which appears, in the space-time manifold of the specific universe in which we are embedded in. But the state syntax of operator that is hologically mapped to M may reflect more general syntaxes that speak to the soul being a more general entity than just specific mind, let alone a specific brain of a specific individual, but that may appear in higher strata during the metaphysics, where it is higher in the course of self-identification of reality than the specific actualization and potentialization that occur within the specific life of an individual. And just as M relates metasimultaneously to L and U, there is a possibility at this point that the soul of the person metasimultaneously appears within the universe and may not be defined with temporal sequences where the soul is built step by step. Rather, it deploys within the temporal sequences of the metrized U, but it speaks to the more general structure of the metaphysical self-identification of M as it hologically projects itself through identification within L operators that achieve the LU coupling, which contains these temporal sequences, but which may not be reducible to it. So later we'll look further into this U, L, and the different recursive dependence that exists within the different aspects of M.